Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with Atraxa Mill. This is a donation deck that comes from Loki Charm. Thank you for supporting the channel, Loki Charm. They say, "Hi Cursed, mill decks have always been my favorite, and in pursuit of trying to find a semi-unique one, Atraxa stood out to me when rad counters were introduced. In the early turns, I find this deck struggles to keep up with some aggressive strategies. I like to see if I can bump this deck up to a bracket 3 if possible, as I do have access to faster lands, but I was wondering if you had some ideas regarding either early game consistency or more quickly getting to the late game." And as for budget, they say they want to get to 500. Most is the budget, which of course, as always, I'm not going to crack into that too much. $500 is a lot to upgrade the deck, and I think honestly, if you took almost any commander deck that isn't already CEDH or very high power level, and you hand someone $500 and say, upgrade the deck, I would say that the deck itself would be extremely different by the end of it. I'm not going to say unrecognizable, but there would be such a difference in cards, unless someone just wanted to buy does $500, how many dual lands does that buy? Probably not a lot, but still, unless it's going into one or two cards, the deck is going to fundamentally change. And that's something I don't want to happen. And in fact, talking about this deck and the core and how it can change back and forth will be a big discussion in this video, especially the idea of proliferate mill. But I'm getting ahead of ourselves. First, we got to start looking at the commander, and from there, we will get right into it. If you'd like to take a look at the deck list we're talking about today, or if you'd like to submit your own deck list to me so that I can make a video assisting your deck, please check the video description down below. So who is Atraxa Praetor's Voice, and why are they our 4-color mill commander? Well, mill isn't exactly correct here. It's more like mill proliferate, or as we will get into very quickly, proliferate mill. Atraxa Praetor's Voice is a 4 mana in every color except for red, so green, white, blue, black. Legendary Phyrexian Angel Horror. They're a 4/4 flying vigilance death touch lifelink creature with one really important line of text. At the beginning of your end step, proliferate. Now, something really interesting about Atraxa is that I think even now Atraxa is one of the most popular commanders by a wide margin. Now, I hear back and forth on why that is exactly. I asked a few of my friends, they seem to see Atraxa as a planeswalker commander, but I've also seen Atraxa as a +1/+1 counter commander, because with this color pie, you do get pretty much every +1/+1 counter card that really matters. Because most of +1/+1 counters are in, I would say, Abzan, green, white, black colors, like the best abilities of it. But blue also gives you more proliferate, gives you a little more reach, and red just isn't as important as the others to kind of play around in this space. Don't get me wrong, red has some really, really cool modified cards and other effects with +1/+1 counters, but this is kind of like a really good whole package to start off with. However, regardless if you do planeswalkers or you go with +1/+1 counters, Atraxa herself is just a very, very strong beater that grows very easily, because after that first +1/+1 counter, she will grow herself, while getting a lot of value, not immediately, but by the end step. Now, we're gonna have to talk soon, not quite yet, but soon, about the value of proliferate, and specifically what mana value or what, let's say, opportunity cost I would attach to proliferate. Because proliferate is something that used to be very difficult to do, and as time has gone on, it's become easier and easier to achieve. So we need to kind of figure out exactly the value of it, and a lot of that is tied into what we are proliferating. But before we get into that, we do need to see what we are proliferating, and this is the crux of the deck. And this is the rad counters. Now, there is this radiation card, and this is just an explanation of rad counters. And so rad counters say, basically, or rad counters as existence, because they don't have, the rule text is on radiation. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, if you have any rad counters, mill that many cards. For each non-land card milled this way, you lose 1 life and a rad counter. So how does this work in practice? It means that every rad counter you have is worth 1 non-land mill in your deck, right? Every time you mill a land with a rad counter, the rad counter stays. Every time you mill a non-land, you lose a life and you lose the rad counter. So this brings me to my first kind of tension in the deck. And this is, I'm not going to say unintentional, like this is an understood tension. I know Loki Charm understands this because we only have so many radiation cards and we only have so many ways to mill with them. So this is kind of baked in. But the idea is that rad counters are more effective at dealing damage than they are at milling, right? Fundamentally, let's look at it like this. In order for you to mill the entirety of your opponent's decks with rad counters, they will lose, let's say, they need to mill 100 cards, but in the process will probably lose 60-ish life, right? Assuming you can do it all in one go, the losing life per card put into the graveyard is going to knock them out of the game before the milling does, which is kind of interesting. Now, with that in mind, we are trying to supplement that problem, let's say, with cards that are just mill-centric or mill-focused. We even have the benefit of certain cards, such as Consuming Aberration, that actually guarantee milling certain numbers of lands so that we can push the rad counters hitting non-land permanents more often than not, which you might say, but Cursed, is that what we want? And that's a really, really good question. See, here's the kind of stressor, right? On one side, we have a deck that is going to be very, very strong on the back of +1/+1 counters and other counters going on our creatures and being able to take advantage of that. And on the other hand, we're going to have a deck that mills. Now, this is common in hybrid strategies. You want a deck that does both simultaneously, and you want both strategies to somewhat complement each other. And in the current build of the deck, I'm going to suggest there are fewer cards that complement both strategies as well as I'd like. There are some, and some of them are really elegantly put together, as some of them are just straight up cards like Vexing Radgull, which does a really good impression of both sides, both creating the rad counters and proliferating, something I do particularly like. And we have a few other cards that lean in both directions as well. Obviously, cards like Wise Mothman are very, very good here. But even just little things like Shieldred, that is just a very, very good card. And on the back gets proliferation and a little bit of mill. Is that mill very consequential? No, but at the same time, it is something we do need to consider. So, what do I want to do with this deck? Well, my main idea right now is that we are suffering from a bit of a mana problem. Let's take a look at the curve itself. Our curve goes up to 4, and 4 is the same mana cost as our commander, so that's a bit of a problem there. And then we kind of plateau over here for a little bit. We've got 5 cards that are 5 mana, we've got 5 cards that are 6 mana, and we have 3 total cards at 7 mana. That is quite a lot of cards that we really need to hold up their own weight, and those 4 mana cards are they're really doing a lot here. There's a lot of them, and they're all competing with Atraxa, while Atraxa is, well, the girl we need to summon every single time, because she is very, very instrumental to how this deck works. So, looking at the cards I want to cut, I think I'm going to start with the 4 mana cards, and I'm going to go up, and we're going to put a lot of scrutiny on these cards. But besides that, I will say there's a few things I do want to point out because these are below that mana cost, is we have a lot of 3 mana rocks. Now don't get me wrong, I do see the use of Crucible Worlds when you're milling yourself. I do see the use of Glistening Sphere as a proliferate and a mana rock, and this corrupted text that we cannot actually turn on, but we'll get back to that in additions. I can see the use of those, but Chromantic Lantern, Commander's Sphere, even Replicating Ring to an extent in this deck is far too slow and so much of a investment. I'd rather those just be a few more copies of Farseek and Rampant Growth. We can use 3 Visits, we can use Nature's Lore, things like that just to kind of smooth out the deck. But even without that, I'm going to have additions that lower that mana curve even further. Alright, so talked a lot about the idea of what the deck is trying to do. Let's pinpoint the cards that I think are holding the deck back from succeeding at what it's trying to do. So, like I said, we're going to start at 4 mana. And right at the top, we have Atraxa. Obviously, we love Atraxa. We can't take her out. She is going to be hopefully one of the fewer 4-mana cards when we're done. Starting with Bloatfly Swarm, we've got these cards that add rad counters are so valuable, and rad counters are so difficult to get that we're put in a situation that we're almost incentivized to play every single one of them. One of my patrons suggested that we even add the 5-mana, it is the, try to remember what it's called, the Murloc Queen as well. But I'm having a bit of a tough time with this. A lot of these cards are not really strong, and the ones that are strong, such as the Wise Mothman, are very strong. So I kind of want these to be tutors. Now, I'm not putting this into additions because I wanted to just have this conversation here and quick, because I don't know if the deck builder wants to play tutors, but if you could get like Eladamri's Call, even that would be enough, because it would ensure that you can grab cards like the Wise Mothman, which is our ideal rad counter distributor, and not have to also play cards like Blowfly Storm, right? So, like, let's look at Blowfly Storm. I do appreciate it's a 4-mana 5/5 flying. It works really well with Proliferate, and if damage would be dealt to this creature while it has a +1/+1 counter, prevent it, remove that many counters, then give each player a rad counter for each +1/+1 counter removed this way. Whew, that's a lot of text. This is a good card, and I want to keep this, but with no ways to trigger that second line of text ourselves, I am going to argue that most of the time, this is just going to be a 5/5 flyer. Actually, that's not fair. Most of the time it'll be a 6/6 flyer or higher. I just don't really see people blocking this, and I don't see people removing this with damage, right? This kind of text doesn't say when your opponent deals damage to this creature or blocks this creature, you get a benefit. This text says your opponents do not block this creature, your opponents do not remove this creature outside of Swords to Plowshares, Dismember, things like that. That'll cleanly remove this without triggering the second ability. And don't get me wrong, there are situations where you could get your opponent cast Blasphemous Act, for example, and you get the benefit off of it. But if Blowfly Swarm has less than 13 +1/+1 counters, you still only add rad counters according to the number of +1/+1 counters that were removed. This is great though, because if you have a 15/15 Blowfly Swarm and someone Blasphemous Acts, you get to keep this Blowfly Swarm while putting 13 rad counters on everyone. Is that ever going to actually happen? I don't know. I really don't want to get your hopes up. I think your opponents have to misplay pretty seriously for that to happen, or have to be threatened by something else to the point that they're not that worried about rad counters. So all of this to say, I really don't like Blowfly Swarm. I think it's particularly weak here. Cleopatra is interesting. I feel like this belongs in a more dedicated legendary creature deck. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of legendary creatures in this deck, but this being at 4 mana, this being a very specific kind of setup, this being only working with, you know, a legendary creature has to be on a legendary creature, and that legendary creature has to die. I see the perks of this, don't get me wrong, but I would like some self-sacrifice in the deck. I would like some ways to sacrifice your creatures at instant speed, preferably without using mana, so that you can take the most advantage off of this, right? Because much more realistically, Cleopatra just gets removed, and then all of the other creatures, it doesn't matter if they die or not, because you aren't drawing anymore. It's also arguable that, you know, a like exile effect, once again, just like the Bloatfly, gets around this trigger. So this being a 4 mana, this having somewhat of a, you know, being on theme, but not on the mill theme. Honestly, you could just use this as like, you could play Phyrexian Arena or something like that, and you'd probably be happier because it would be more consistent. After that, we have Azuri. And with Azuri, we can now have that proliferate conversation. How much mana would you pay for proliferation? And I think the argument is very, very little, right? You would pay maybe 1 or 2 mana for just proliferation, and for proliferation, an additional effect. How much would you pay? Well, your question becomes, what is that additional effect? So let's give it a comparison. Azuri says proliferate twice, draw 2 cards is worth 7 mana. Do you agree? I don't know if I do, and I have a hard time with that. Now, don't get me wrong, I do understand that the value of this is this line here, where whenever you proliferate, draw a card. So for that basis, we're keeping Azuri. Azuri is not on the chopping block. The question is, how often do you pay the 3 on a card like this? Yes, when you have the mana for it, late game, it's a mana sink. These are all good things. But we can use that as a basis to look at the other cards and other things that we're doing. Now, comparing proliferate can be tough unless we talk about what we're comparing proliferate to, right? Like, what I mean by that is, okay, if I proliferate a poison counter on each of my opponents versus I proliferate a rad counter on each of my opponents versus I proliferate a +1/+1 counter on each of my creatures. All of these are different things, right? And I would put different values on them. I think proliferating a +1/+1 counter on all my opponents is worth about 2 mana, because there are 2 mana white cards that just do that. Put a +1/+1 counter on all your opponents, on your creatures. Likewise, putting an infect counter or poison counter onto each of my opponents is worth about 3 mana. So it's worth more, and I like to do it a little more. Rad counters are nebulous. See, the tricky part about rad counters is that they're very easy to apply and they're very difficult to proliferate, because if you don't time it correctly, your opponents will not have any rad counters left, right? If you're able to go play Mothman and then after that play your commander and proliferate all of that, that's great. But if you play Mothman and all of a sudden Mothman is removed, and through the turn cycle, your opponents lose their rad counters because of how the mechanic works, well, when you play Atraxa and you go to end your turn, they don't have any more rad counters. So in a weird way, proliferating rad counters is incredibly valuable, but you want to put as many of them as you can in one go, because that is what's going to keep them on your opponents. Does that make sense? I hope it does. That's going to be kind of the standard. We're going to compare some of these proliferate cards, and some of the proliferate cards I want to add is that I would prefer very, very heavily to be able to proliferate multiple times in one turn to ensure we have 3 to 4 rad counters on our opponents, with the dream that once it comes back, each opponent has at least 1 more rad counter left, so that we don't need to put as much effort into proliferating again. Okay, back to this. Moving on to Fathom Mage. Fathom Mage feels like Azuri, but more work. I think easy cut, we can get rid of her. Mind Rack Harpy. This feels like you're overpaying for this. This should be Hedron Crab, or what's the Ruin Crab would do a better impression of this. I don't see any other purpose of using this card. This is a very easy cut. Once again, 4 mana is too much with our commander. We can toss that out. Nike Ambusher. This is an interesting one. I'm gonna say we should cut this card. I do really appreciate that 4 rad counters is exactly the number I just described, but it was 4 rad counters on each opponent, and Nightkin Ambusher is 4 rad counters on a single opponent. And for that reason, I don't particularly like it. Once again, this is a card we'd only ever cast after our commander, which means in essence it's not actually a 4 mana card, it's as if it's 5 or more, so there's a bit of tension there. And even then, I don't think this ability of a 4/4 Ward 2 can't be blocked is even worth 4 mana in commander, so with that in mind, I think that's an easy cut. Master Transcendent is definitely the weaker of the two between them and the Wise Mothman. The Master Transcendent gives target player 2 rad counters and then does not add counters further. Don't get me wrong, this does have some synergy with your deck because you can start milling your opponent. And it doesn't have to be your graveyard, so any creature milled can come onto your side as long as the master's there, and that's pretty cool. But once again, it is one of the weaker rad counter cards. Still, we have to play it because we have so few, and honestly, it's still pretty strong. Wise Mothman, as mentioned several times, is possibly the best card for this deck, and is maybe even a secret commander in this deck where you need this card just as much as Atraxa to get going. Toothy, Imaginary Friend, feels a little strange here. Don't get me wrong, I like this way more than like Cleopatra, so if you have to keep one of these, I will keep Cleopatra. And Toothy doesn't have the problem that Bloatfly Swarm or Cleopatra have, where if it's removed in a different way other than dying or damage, all of a sudden it doesn't work. This works no matter what, as long as it leaves the battlefield. That being said, there is a little bit of clunkiness here, right? Because ideally, once again, you have Atraxa out already, then you go and cast Toothy, and then you need to be able to draw a card or put a +1/+1 counter on this card, which there are ways of doing that, but if you don't, you have to wait a turn cycle with a 1/1 because you can't proliferate when there's nothing on it. It comes back to you, you draw, you put a +1/+1 counter on it, and there, bam, you can start proliferating it. With that in mind, I believe Toothy is very vulnerable to everything during that time, and if one of your opponents was already going to board clear or deal with Atraxa or something like that, Toothy is basically inconsequential and just a really slow, clunky draw engine. So I really don't like Toothy. I am blown away. I guess it's just the partner commander idea here is why it has this price, but I just do not understand how this card is worth so much money. It's just, you need to really dedicate resources into this. Going through the rest real quickly, Damnation is great. Atomize is fine, I don't mind it, but I think there's an argument of this is still overloading the 4 mana slot, and I'd really just rather this be Beast Within and say, forget it. You can't proliferate all the time, let's let that go. Radstorm, however, Storm Proliferate is a lot more fun, and potentially with some additions and changes is going to be a lot more effective with a lot more lower mana cards. At the moment, it does feel rather clunky because you need to have a lot of mana and the right cards to use it, but the ceiling on a card like this is rather high, so I don't want to necessarily cut it. Empowered Auto Generator is cool, but really slow. Don't get me wrong, I do see how this can get really strong, but I think even late game, unless you're drawing a lot of cards, it's going to represent 1 extra spell as opposed to a ton of extra spells. See, you don't really need this kind of mana late game. You need this mana early game. Even as the deck builder put out in their comment, is that they're struggling to get to the mid-late game, not struggling to get from the mid to the extreme late game, which is what this card is very good at. It can give you so much advantage so quickly, but you need to make that 4 mana, and during that time, your opponents who have been setting up their boards are going to hyper-focus you and take you out because you've represented an incredibly high mana generation artifact, while, truth be told, you just don't have a lot of cards that take advantage of it. So I don't really see it being particularly good. Reconcraft Theta is not good. This card is very much so held up by this line of text here, and as we've seen, that is a line of text that we can put on a 2 mana creature and be fine with it, or a 3 mana creature with upside. And this card just doesn't have enough upside because even with the flying, even with the creature generation, Crew 2 is still something you need to do. And we're just cutting these 4 mana cards, so toss it. Struggle for Project Purity. Once again, I feel like this is almost necessary because of the rad counter situation. But I'm gonna say still no. This is still dependent on your opponents cooperating with you in a way that for you to get the rad counters. You don't get the rad counters on your turn, so you don't get that Atraxa proliferation until it cycles back. And frankly, I really don't know if it's going to matter because unlike even ghostly prison effects or propaganda effects, nothing is actually preventing them from not running into you. If they need you to be knocked out, they will knock you out. This also does not stop them from attacking you with very tall creatures like 10/10 or Eldrazi, and they're only going to get 1 rad counter for their trouble, which is a great deal for them and not so great for you. So easy to remove. Luckily 5, 6, 7 are quick, so we'll go through them. Consuming Aberration, I get why this is here. This is good, but I really don't think this is what I want in this deck. You need a bunch of cards in hand and you need a bunch of mana to do that. Once again, these are things the deck struggles with. In the meantime, you're going to cast a Consuming Aberration. It's going to get removed and you're going to sit there going, oh, whoops, and having spent 5 mana. So I think the Aberration is easy to cut. Whereas on the other side, Sir Conrad, I think, does a better impression with this because it melds that idea between the milling and the damage that rad counters represent a lot, like a lot more cleanly, and will probably do way more damage in such a quick succession that your opponents will have to deal with it. And that's probably better for you because you'll be able to knock out players this way. And this itself has a mana sink. Yes, it doesn't mill as much as the Consuming Aberration, but this here being able to pump more mana into and get more triggers off of a few of your cards is going to be worthwhile, I think. I'm skipping Shoulder because I already spoke about her, but she is perfect here. I think she's really, really strong and definitely the kind of deck that benefits with the proliferation on the backside, because if you have ever resolved the True Scriptures to the end, you know Shieldred is a crazy card. I use her in my Brina deck. If I had more copies, I'd put her in more copies of my decks because she is a very good 5-mana card. Inexorable Tide, once again, this is a weird comparison to Consuming Aberration where it only really works when you're casting other spells. However, obviously Proliferate does a lot more here. So this is kind of a comparison to your commander in the sense that if you are at least casting 1 spell a turn, you are getting 1 Proliferate a turn. Though then I say, well, you want the Proliferate after you cast in this deck. Still, I think this is fine. I think the redundancy is really, really nice. I've always really, really liked this art. And the original set this comes from is very deep in my heart. So I love this card. So you should absolutely keep it. Mirari's Wake, on the other hand, feels like an afterthought here. Once again, we got mana ramp, but after 5 mana, which doesn't seem to be the point in the game you need it anymore. And these creatures you control get +1/+1. Feels like it has nothing to do with the deck and should just not belong here. It's really this line of text that you care about, and at this mana cost, this is not where the deck wants to be. In a dedicated ramp deck, in a dedicated mana doubling deck, this is much stronger, but here it's not particularly good. Likewise, Muldrotha the Gravetide feels way too much mana for this deck to get very little benefit from. Don't get me wrong, I once again do understand the benefit here of milling yourself and then being able to Muldrotha the permanents back onto the battlefield. That's great, but 6 mana is a lot, and this just doesn't fundamentally work to accelerate your game plan. It's more like an incidental victory for having milled yourself. And I think there's just going to be better versions of this card. Heck, you could just say Eternal Witness is a better version of this card because it will get you something you've milled out of your deck immediately, and then you can cast it because you now have 3 extra mana that you would have spent on Muldrotha. There's something there that I think is just more valuable. So, great card. I love Muldrotha, but a bit too clunky for this deck. Screeching Scorch Beast. Once again, I think it's fine. This is a little bit necessary for the rad counters. I do like that this creates more bodies, so that's very, very nice. But I also really just like that it's not 4 mana. So despite the fact that it may not be the strongest rad card, it is one that does not compete with our commander. It is one that is not just an ETB, it's an attack, so you have more control over it. And that's not even just, it's a 5/5 flyer that creates 2/2s every turn. I think that's phenomenal. So I think this is a really good inclusion. Haunt of the Hightower, on the other hand, I'm really starting to get a little confused here because I fundamentally understand the +1/+1 mechanic and the mill mechanic. So this creature will get very, very big very, very quickly. But that being said, it is still just a beater in the air. It will not mill your opponents any faster. Your proliferates onto this are particularly bad. Once again, let's think about the idea of the value of the proliferation. Proliferating +1/+1 counters on the Haunt of Hightower is akin to 1 card going into your opponent's graveyard from anywhere. Something that's incredibly easy to trigger. So every time you proliferate the Haunt of the Hightower, you basically didn't do anything because by a turn cycle, it will have grown 7 more times than that proliferation would have allowed. So honestly, this feels really, really out of place. I remember when this card came out, they talked about how they were considering it as a much lower mana card with much lower strength in abilities, and I think it would have done a lot better. 6 mana for this card is just way too much, and though it has some synergy with your deck, not in the way that I like it, right? The comparison between this and Screeching Scorchbeast is all you need to know. One is way better than the other, and further, and like also at the same time, furthers your game plan. So cut the high tower for sure. Contagion Engine is fine. It's not one I particularly love, but here it is a targeted, a targeted semi-board clear. For 4 mana, you get to proliferate twice, which is really good. It feels like a necessary evil, and I think that's fine. Sometimes this card is just going to rot in your hand, but as we cut the 6 mana cards, I don't think that's going to be as much of a problem. Vault 12, the Necropolis. I think it's the same line of text here where I'm going to say, do you have to play this because each player gets 3 rad counters? I think kind of. I do really like the idea of playing this after Atraxa, so you go, each player gets 3 rad counters, then you proliferate, so you add, so now each total number among players. So everyone then has 4 rad counters, so that's 16, and then you get 16 2/2s. Yeah, you know what, this is good enough. But if your commander is not out, this gets considerably worse, especially because those rad counters are not guaranteed to stick around, but I don't know, this is fine. I feel like I'm bullying this card if I go any further. Finally, coming to the end at the 7 mana cards, Into the Story and Breach of the Multiverse are great here. I love them. Agent Frank Horrigan, Horrigan? I don't know who this is. This isn't good. This is cute. I do really appreciate that on ETB and attack, you proliferate twice. But remember, how much does 2 proliferations cost? I said it didn't cost 7, and now this is 7. I don't know. I don't particularly like this. If you can guarantee haste on this, I do like it, but this is a lot of mana just to proliferate twice, just to have a beater, because that's what it is. Agent Frank Horrigan is a beater in a deck that is trying to mill. Okay, I want to go to additions because I've gone on for a while on this one, but before I do, I just want to pick out just a few cards here and there. And they are cards such as Cruel Somnophage or Can't Wake Up. This is the kind of point of the deck that I think you shouldn't be playing these cards. These cards only interact with the mill portion of your deck, and that's not great, because especially Cruel Somnophage, it requires cards in your graveyard, opponent's graveyards already. All graveyards. So you need cards in any graveyard already that are creatures. And until then it doesn't do anything, so it's not actually an early game play that'll protect you from your opponents. And Can't Wake Up only targets 1 player, so what really this is a 4 mana card, because if you don't have the means to do anything like any other milling early on, Cruel Somnophage has to wait for Can't Wake Up to be cast, then you cast Cruel Somnophage for like a 2/2. Doesn't feel particularly good. I don't think this is a great card. Alright, let's go into some additions. Coming into additions, I want to start off by suggesting the 1 mana dorks. Now, I know I said earlier that we can use Nature's Lore and 3 visits and cards like this, but I think this deck can actually very much so benefit by using these kind of cards. Now, obviously, you can't play the Ignoble Hierarch, and maybe you don't want to play Delighted Halfling, but a combination of these kind of cards will do wonders for the deck. Not only will it bring out your 3 mana cards really quickly, and this is a deck that relies a lot on its 3 slot, but as mentioned before in a lot of videos on the subject, these creatures can have +1/+1 counters on them. And so with how Atraxa works, all of a sudden your early mana dorks that help you set up, help you get through that early game like you were asking, they become threats, right? And they don't have to be huge threats. They go from being 1/1s to 2/2s, and by the time they have a second +1/+1 counter on them, which is how Atraxa works because she can't put that first one on, they are 3/3s, and they are at least very good blockers, and you will be generally happy with that effect. I do something very similar in my Bumbleflower deck, where I use a lot of 1 mana dorks with the knowledge that they can grow exceptionally quickly into being threats, or at least cards that can defend me from other threats. And so this is probably the biggest suggestion. I have a bunch of suggestions, but this is probably the one I think I want you to take the most. By doing this, your deck will speed up and the early game will become easier. On that note, I do like Song of Freyalise because it kind of packages everything I just said in a delicious little 2-mana saga that you can proliferate, that gives a +1/+1 counter that you can then proliferate, and gives you one really, really good attack because of giving Vigilance, Trample, Indestructible on that turn. For anyone who's never used this, like, a free attack in Commander is always really, really good. You can take advantage of it to, you know, grab, for example, like the Monarchy or Initiative. But even then, it's just good to kind of pick the opponent that you're having a lot of trouble with and then focus on them one like 12, 13, 14 damage attack that can really put them in a position where they need to be more defensive and therefore can't be as aggressive. So this is a card I do particularly like. Of course, I tend to like it more in token decks, but I think it still has a lot of value here for that first +1/+1 counter. After that, speaking of proliferation, there's two cards here. I think one's going to come a little later, but there's a few cards here about proliferation that I did want to mention. Park Heights Maverick is one I really, really like. This one I think got kind of forgotten about because it came during that new Capenna time where we were inundated with all of these cards that do all of these things. But this does a lot of things in a way I really, really like. One, this is an evasive creature that therefore it has a easier time getting in. It has Dethrone, so it puts its own +1/+1 counters onto itself, but much more importantly, it has this line of text. Whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player or dies, proliferate. This generally will allow you to get at least that one proliferation off. If you can't attack with this creature, you can at least bet on the fact that when it dies, you will get that proliferation. I know I was talking earlier about that dies trigger is harder to kind of play with, but Parkside Maverick isn't as important of a trigger as, you know, the Bloat Flies or something like that. This is not something someone's going to use Swords to Plowshares on. So with that in mind, I think the ceiling is pretty high on this because of how good Proliferate can be in your deck, but the floor is pretty high because this is a 2/2 creature on attack, is regularly going to be a 3/3, and once it hits, it proliferates into a 4/4, and you're pretty happy there. It then becomes a self-sufficient threat that you can just have invested 3 mana in and forget about it. Especially with those mana dorks I mentioned before, it can be played on the second turn, which gives it a high chance of getting through. Another Proliferate card that I think is very much worth considering is Thirsting Roots. I have mentioned this before, I'll mention this again. This first line of text is really, really good. Please do not undervalue how good this line of text is, especially in a 4-color deck. With Proliferate as a secondary option, and as mentioned before, Proliferate being worth about 1 mana, this is a particularly strong card that I think you should run. Likewise, a suggestion that was passed to me by my patrons was Drown in Ichor, which I think is a very, very good one. -4/-4 and Proliferate. It'll get around, you know, a lot of these like indestructible cards, but much more importantly, you can just use this to trade someone's commander, which tend to be less than 4 toughness, and get a Proliferate trigger, which is going to be particularly good. So, pretty decent card. Also, you can just cast this out early as removal to protect yourself from some threats. A Fallout card that I noticed that wasn't in here that I think needs to be in here is Cathedral Acolyte. Each creature you control with a counter on it has Ward 1, and then this creature puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature that entered this turn. I think this is like straightforwardly meant to work with Proliferation because it's here to put that first +1/+1 counter onto your creatures, which is really, really valuable. Now, it's not like Orenleaf, the green tapping land from original Zendikar that puts, I believe it puts a counter on each creature that came into play. I think it's each green creature that entered the battlefield that turn. So that could be something worth considering, but this is just fine. I think this is just really, really good. Obviously, if you can give it haste, it can put that first counter on itself. But this plus the whole giving all of your creatures Ward 1 is very, very valuable, and I think a very strong card. Speaking of strength, I think it's very much so worth considering Bloodchief Ascension. I talked about this before, how we use Proliferate and damage dealing and milling as one package, and Bloodchief Ascension represents that exactly. Now, this is a pricey card, don't get me wrong. It's a very, very powerful card, but it represents by itself doing enormous amounts of damage. getting enormous amounts of life to you, and obviously after that initial opponent losing 2 life, putting that quest counter, and you can proliferate up to 3 easily, because it is sometimes tricky to get that proliferation, those quest counters onto it, is what I would say. But rad counters are uniquely very, very good at getting Bloodchief Ascension online. So I feel like this is like the perfect card for a deck like this, and I think you should very much so run it, to the point that I think it's also worth considering, do you want to play the combo? Now there's Mindcrank, there's also a Dimir Guild Mage, and I think there's at least one other card that does this, but it has the text that says whenever an opponent loses life, that player mills that many cards. And if you don't know, these 2 cards become an infinite combo, because whenever they take damage, they mill. Whenever they mill, they take damage, and this goes on until they're out of the game. In the meantime, you also gain tons and tons of life, and as soon as you can trigger it on your other opponents, you can knock them out of the game as well. Now, that would be a 2-card infinite combo, so I leave it up to you to decide exactly where you land on it. I forget if that power level 3 allows you to have at least 1 infinite combo. I'm not sure about that, but if you're just playing Bloodchief Ascension, that's good enough, but I would be amiss to name one and not the other. I wouldn't be doing my due diligence, I'd say. Speaking of doing my due diligence, let's talk about the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is you have no ways of putting poison counters on your opponents. And when you are playing Proliferate, I think it is very much so worthwhile to just consider that first point of poison counters. Now, that can be Glistener Elf, which can function in this deck very well, because as it grows, it has Infect and not Toxic. This could be one of those spells that will put a poison counter on each of your opponents. There's a lot of those from the new Phyrexia set. Up to you. There's a lot of ways to do this, but it is contentious, and I do get that. A lot of people will be, once they see this, they're going to go after you because people get a little salty over poison counters, and the fact that you are a proliferation deck, so you have ways of continuing to proliferate even if you don't attack them. For some people that feels cheap, and to them I say, that's rough, buddy. This is a game of Magic where you're trying to knock out your opponents. I will say that I think it is incredibly powerful to have at least one version of this effect. The one I'm going to suggest to you the most is Bloated Contaminator, because it is toxic and I think that's cute, but also because it just has another line of that text: whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, proliferate. With Trample, that's really easy to trigger, but it works so fundamentally in how your deck wants to get working. It benefits so much from that first +1/+1 counter. It can like set up that you play Bloated Contaminator, you play Mothman, put a counter, attack with the Contaminator, you proliferate the rad counters. Like, you're going to be really, really happy with those kind of scenarios. So I think this is very much so worth playing. And that Toxic 1 will get people sometimes and give you kind of a long-term game plan should your opponents be mill-proof or otherwise impede your mill plans, right? So I think this is worth playing. The alternative would be Vishgraz the Doomhive, which is a big, big favorite of mine. This is a card I played as a Proliferate commander, and I didn't play a single other... Okay, that's not true. Outside of Bloated Contaminator, I didn't play any other toxic or poison counter cards because Vishgraz by themselves generates enough toxicity. That's a funny sentence, but generates enough toxicity to kind of deal with that, right? Vishgraz by itself creates 3 Phyrexian Mites, so that's 4 Toxic 1 creatures. Vishgraz themselves is hard to block with the Menace, but you can also set up situations where that first attack, you just attack with the Mites or something, get a poison counter here and there, and Vishgraz starts growing. This also works really well because Vishgraz has this weird imbalance built in where Vishgraz deals mainly non-poison damage, because Vishgraz can get really, really big in power and toughness, but only deals 1 poison counter every attack, which can be weird because you might be thinking, but I do want to poison out my opponents. And also has this weird tension where when Vishgraz knocks out, or you knock out one of your opponents, Vishgraz actually reduces in power because there's less power of players in the game with poison counters, which is funny. But here, it's not that much of a problem because you're trying to use the other elements of the deck to work around Vishgrass. I'm talking about putting +1/+1 counters on Vishgrass. I'm talking about using the rad counters and talking about using the toxic as just a kind of bonus thing. Meanwhile, Vishgrass is just going to be attacking, smashing face, and having 3 1/1s that they themselves can get +1/+1 counters is going to be rather good. So this is another suggestion, but if you have to pick one, it would be Bloated Contaminator. And that's it for the deck. There's a lot more that I could say. In fact, I think there might be an argument that you could take that 500 and put it directly into the mana base. I didn't mention this. I said that's all I have to say. Cabal Coffers and Urborg feel kind of out of place here. Don't get me wrong, I can see a lot of your higher mana cards are black, so it will help you get there, but with no way to tutor them, and the majority of a deck leading up to that being of all 4 colors, it seems like a trickier card to get going. With that, as I was about to say, if you wanted to take that 500 and spend like 400 on fetch lands and shocks, I think that would be probably really decent. The deck would function by itself a lot better. You wouldn't be as worried about having to play cards such as Chromatic Lantern, but that's not as fun and that's not as exciting. I think the cards I mainly suggested are rather cheap, so you can still do that if you wish. But I will say, there's a lot of suggestions I wanted to make that would fundamentally change this deck. Remember, we started with this idea that if you handed me $500 and gave me this deck, you would have a different deck by the end of it. This is very much true here. This deck is really interesting, but I feel like it's pulled into a lot of directions. And that is the nature of trying to brew something yourself while you're using a very, commonly used mechanic on a very uncommonly used mechanic to get a strange melange of the two, right? We're talking about rad counter mill. And this is kind of what happens. This is not a failure, this is a work in progress. So I'm really interested to see, as the deck is being built, where it narrows its game plan. Because as it narrows its game plan, we'll get closer into exactly the kind of cards we want to play, the exact power level we want to play at, and what kind of strategies we can kind of will bloom out of that, right? Otherwise, I feel like there's a lot of like little cards I can point out, stuff like Wizard's Class that doesn't fundamentally work with the plan, but also, who cares? We're figuring out what the plan is. We'll get there eventually, there's no rush. Thank you so much. I really hope that you send me another deck sometime soon. Another version of this especially, because I am interested to see where it's going. Until then, good luck, happy deck building. Thank you so much for watching. This video is brought to you by viewers like you and people on my Patreon. If you'd like to send me another draft of this deck, or any deck, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you'd like to make your deck one of my donation decks I work on, there's a link there too. Finally, if you'd like to like, comment, subscribe, I would be very appreciative. It helps the channel quite a bit. Thank you and good luck in brewing and building.